Mr. Pierce, I think if you look at the written statement, Mr. Johnson looks at this situation in reverse. He seems to view it that regulators are good guys and presumes banks are bad guys who just want to somehow game the system. The statement was absolutely silent and failed to address in any way whatsoever over-regulation, which is the point of this bill and the point of this hearing that we're having here. Mr. McKillop and Mr. Whalen, I wonder if you could each share with me how important you think cash flows are versus collateral value. Aren't the regulators focusing too much on collateral value and not enough on cash flows?
Yes, if we had a situation where the FASB board did suggest that we would, in effect, go on mark-to-market rules through appraisals, and it would have been the end of small and medium-sized business. It would have been absolute chaos. I mean, how often do you go in to get an appraisal? Every week, every month, every 6 months? The reality of it is that you can ups and downs in appraisals, but cash flow is still the mother's milk of repaying a loan. And that is one thing that has occurred here, which is, I think, an excessive use of appraisals. You did have excessive appraisals there for a while. We've swung to the other side. I had a situation where we put in $13.5 million of hard infrastructure into a development. Basically, the appraisal came back unchanged from the year before. I said, wait a minute, I just spent $13.5 million, here's the bills. Well, you know, it's a tough market. The point being is, I do think that there is exactly that, way too much emphasis on what's the appraisal of the day, the appraisal du jour, and not enough on looking at historical and cash flow trends.
Okay. Thank you very much.
At best, the collateral value is generally a secondary source of repayment. The primary source is cash flow. As bankers, we always look to that first.
And is there in banking any better measure of an account, in your opinion, than the simple matter that the payments are made on a timely basis?
That was the old idea, yeah. Borrow the money and pay it back.
You know, I get a feeling that there's two kinds of people in this room. There's people who see the problem of arbitrary overregulation, and those that don't. I mean, it's just real simple. And if you don't see the problem, then you'll find all kinds of objections to this legislation because it changes a regulatory environment that some people seem to think is okay and needs to be preserved for whatever reason. But I just don't see how letting a current debt be left on an accrual basis perpetually, as long as payments are made, can harm anybody. I think that's common sense legislation and basically what it's going to take to recover. This is no cost. That unlike some of the big banks that got bailouts, the community banks got bailed on, and most of the community bankers that I'm aware of, a majority of the interest in the banks are held by the officers and directors of the bank, people in the local community. There's not a big spread of stockholders across this nation and around the world whose money they're gambling with. They're gambling with their own money if they're gambling. They're loaning their own money more than they are other people's money, and they're accountable for it. And given the opportunity to work with a homeowner or a small businessman who may be in tough times, they can bring it to a positive conclusion, whereas a heavy-handed monolithic bureaucrat can come in there and just stomp them out of business. You know, in my state, unfortunately, there's probably not very much real estate that's worth today what it was 5 years ago. And so if your loan's over 5 years old and some bureaucratic regulator just decides they need to have a current appraisal, there's a good chance the property is not going to appraise for what it did 5 years ago. And you could essentially take every loan on real estate in our state probably and put it on a non-accrual basis for that reason. And that's bad for Florida, that's bad for the United States of America, and that's